Queen Elizabeth turned to him, bowing gently. She smiled warmly, as always. "Yes, my little one." Without averting her eyes, the child spoke, her voice light but full of genuine curiosity. "What do you think God is?" Queen Elizabeth was walking slowly through one of London's old quarters. The cool air gently caressed her cheeks. Grey clouds obscured the sky. The wind was wandering through the narrow streets, blowing the fallen leaves in front of her. He would not trade the peace of being away from the palace, wandering the magnificent streets of his country, being among the people for anything. Only in such moments could he feel the real world. His visit today was for a charity event. In an old charity centre, clothes donated by people were being meticulously distributed to those in need. People were smiling at each other with their new coats and blankets in their hands, relieved that they would not be cold this winter. Children ran around with bright eyes wearing their new clothes, their mothers gratefully thanking the donors. As the Queen watched in silence from her corner, a small movement in the midst of this scene caught her attention. A little boy was moving towards her, standing out from the crowd. His steps were timid but determined. The old coat he was wearing was a size too big for him. The Queen was immediately intrigued by the boy's wind-blown cheeks and curious eyes. The boy stopped a few steps away. He hesitated at first, then gathered his courage and asked in a soft but clear voice, "Your Majesty." Queen Elizabeth turned to him, bowing gently. As always, she smiled warmly. "Yes, my little one." Without averting his eyes, the child spoke, his voice light but full of genuine curiosity. "What do you think God is?" As soon as the words were out of the child's mouth, the surrounding sounds seemed to disappear. Throughout her life, the Queen had answered countless diplomatic questions, many difficult questions from journalists at grand receptions. But this was something else. All her experience was overwhelmed by the simple but profound question of a small child. He was silent for a few seconds. When he looked into the child's eyes, he saw pure curiosity and perhaps some concern. Hidden in that tiny mind was one of the biggest questions humanity had been asking for thousands of years. "Why do you ask such a thing?" the Queen asked in a soft voice. The child bowed his head, thought for a few seconds. Then he answered slowly. "Sometimes my mother tells me that God protects us," he said. "But last week our neighbor got very sick. Even the doctors couldn't cure him. If God exists, why is everyone not happy?" The Queen took a deep breath at this logical and shocking question. The little boy's question was one that everyone asks themselves at some point in their lives, but often cannot find the answer. She closed her eyes slightly and thought for a moment. The little boy was standing in front of him, waiting for his answer. But the most important thing here was to explain it in a way that the child could understand. "You know," the Queen said, her voice warm and compassionate, "there may not be a definite answer to that question. But some people see God as the good in people. When we help someone, when we listen to someone, when we show compassion, maybe that's when God is with us." The boy listened attentively, keeping his eyes on Queen Elizabeth. He put his little hands in his coat pockets. "So God is the good that people do for each other?" he asked softly. The Queen smiled slightly. "Perhaps so," she said softly. The little boy thought. His little fingers wiggled slightly in his pocket. It was as if he was trying to put things in place in his mind. "But," he said then, his voice a little lower this time, "if God is good, why do people sometimes do bad things?" In front of Queen Elizabeth was an intelligent child who, despite her young age, was asking very difficult questions. Queen Elizabeth was now faced with perhaps one of the most difficult questions in the world. The question of God was one that had occupied philosophers and thinkers for centuries. She took a deep breath. "People are always free to choose, my little child," she said gently. "God can only show us the truth, but which path we choose is up to us." The boy bowed his head, trying to understand this answer. He was silent for a while, then spoke again. "So, when people do bad things, does God get angry with them? The Queen shook her head slightly, trying to understand the child's naive thoughts. Some people say that God exists only out of love, she said. Maybe what matters is whether we can learn from our mistakes. The boy thought for a while. Then he nodded slightly. He didn't know if he fully understood the answer, but it seemed to answer some of his questions. A small smile appeared on his face. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said. Then he slowly turned around and started to run towards his friends. The Queen took a deep breath as she watched him walk away. She looked up at the sky, the clouds still grey, the wind still cold. But inside there was the warmth of the conversation that had just taken place. Some questions might not have a definitive answer, but perhaps what mattered was not finding the right answer, but the journey itself. And sometimes even the curiosity of a child was enough to make the world a better place.